Yes, and you mentioned about corruption and that being, an issue with even some of those contracts, like the 30% procurement that we saw within the NYS being marred by corruption. So some people think that corruption is the single biggest threat to Uhuru Kenyatta's presidency and his delivery of all of his promises that he made before getting elected in 2013. Do you agree?
I think corruption is probably the single most dangerous threat to the re-election of the Jubilee government in many ways. And I think the other things that, other places to look, I think, for the remaining years of this particular administration would be the extent to which public officials are protected or insulated from taking administrative actions or threatening administrative actions that are not grounded in the law. We saw this recently in the case of the attempt to take away Governor Joho's gun. There have been many other cases like this which have been costly both in terms of the credibility of the state, but I think also just in terms of the intentions that are really behind some of those actions that are there. I think the other thing that we need to look carefully and provide oversight on is really the introduction of laws that seek to dilute the vision and the power of our Constitution, because I think that also has been a feature of the last 2 years, and I would hope that over the next couple of years we would see some bold legislating, both from the side of government but also the side of the opposition, that continues to deepen and create teeth around which we can all enjoy the constitutional freedoms and the responsibilities and rights that we all voted for back in 2010. So these were the two things that I think are particularly important. The third one, I think, is I think there are a number of cases where we've seen bold executive orders issued, and public servants either ignore them or frustrate them or basically just delay their implementation. And I think that has to be, I guess, one of the dangers that the president and the deputy president will face as they go back to the ballot and seek our votes again, that many of the ideas that have been put out, and if you go back no further than November, I think 28th of November, when we had the executive orders on the corruption scandals, there were, I think, about 18 particular orders. Those were very powerful statements of intention that I think have yet to see the light of day. The one that we've been particularly concerned about within the Society for International Development has been the promise to provide universal titling for schools. Despite the commitments that we've seen from two cabinet secretaries, the governor of Nairobi, and the president himself, it is really still a shock that no school has been titled 1 year on from the Langata Road Primary School reclamation. Yeah. And many schools still remain in threat. I think 83% of our schools are still threatened by land grabbing because they simply have no legal title.
Indeed, because that is something we saw you come out during that Langata school grab saga. And there was a promise that 7,000 or all the schools in the country would then be able to get their title deeds. So what then needs to happen? Because the promise for this was supposed to be by the end of this month, actually. And this was a promise, like you say, that came from the president and the county government to ensure that all schools get titles. We understand 7,500 schools have applied for this. None of this has happened to date. How important is this?
I think it's critical. I mean, I think it is a matter of public interest. It is a matter, it is enshrined within our constitution, the right to education. The assets and the public assets and the infrastructure that are across this republic in terms of our 29,000 schools cannot be replaced once they're gone. And I think, speedy, judicious action by the Ministry of Lands, the Ministry of Education, and also the National Land Commission, and closer collaboration could really seize what is a low-hanging fruit, I think, for not only the government, but also for the country at large. I mean, we now have probably 2,400 schools that are close to being surveyed and titled, and that really would take no less than a few hours at the National Titling Center. We could have a breakthrough on this, but really we're 8 days away from the deadline that was self-imposed by the government, and there is no sign that we will be able to enter April, just after Easter, with a breakthrough in this area.
All right, just before I let you go, you were talking a little bit about the war on corruption, and we had a very big statement, if you recall. It's coming to just a year ago that the president made his State of the Nation address. It was on the 26th of March last year, and he, tackled corruption head on, but some say it was the manner in which he did it, and it's just picking up on what you talked about earlier, the respect for the rule of law. And many people said that the president's own handling of corruption was indeed itself not in line with the law. In fact, the High Court has cited him for that in the corruption cases against former Cabinet Secretaries Charity Ngilu and Engineer Michael Kamau. Is this then a case of leading from the top, bad leadership from the top, and therefore that trickles down to the rest of his lieutenants?
I think the thing we have to realize is that the corrupt not only have a wide web of partners and fixers, and that they stretch into the courtrooms, into the media houses, into government offices, and to some extent, I think the fight against corruption will always be a long, arduous process. And I think we can't fault the president, who on several occasions last year came out and directly addressed this issue head on. And I think the argument that's been made by a number of high-level government officers that the president overreacted, I think is patently false. I think the epidemic that we've seen in government more recently in terms of the last couple of months really suggests to us that not only are public servants really at risk of the virus of corruption, but actually our very existence as a developed modern state hinges on our ability to be able to crush the scourge of corruption. So I think that's the first point. Coming back to the GOK symposium, one of the thoughts that I had when it closed, that corruption I think is one big issue, but I think the other thing is that until we see senior public servants and government officials turning to public services for their health needs, or to take their children to school, or transport, we have not done enough in this country. And I think one of the challenges that we need to throw back to our leaders is that until they start using public services, then perhaps they haven't done enough to provide us with the capacity to be able to enjoy all the freedoms and the services that are really enshrined within our Constitution. All
right, okay, fair point. Lastly, I know we said before you go just a few minutes ago, but lastly, what happens now? Where does the Jubilee, what's the direction for the Jubilee administration, particularly because we're going into an electioneering period and lots of campaigns? What do they need to do to ensure that any promises they make between now and August 2017 aren't deemed as election promises, but rather promises on delivery that is supposed to happen by any government? We're getting into that political silly season. How do we tell the difference, and what does Jubilee need to do now?
I think the leadership of Jubilee need to, or could look to two areas. The first is that, as we know from some of the statistics that have been generated by opinion polls, up to 72% of our population do not feel that they have any influence over government affairs. I think that's the first place that the leadership of Jubilee could look towards, really creating trust and a sense of, a sense of support from the population, not just their supporters, but even the people who supported, who voted for CORD or for the other parties, and really generate a sense of trust and credibility that the work that they're doing is actually finding impact in terms of poverty, inequalities, and marginalization.
All right.
The second side of it really relates to, if you go back to the 2013, one of the promises that we were given by the Jubilee government was that they would insulate the administration of government from politicians and political activity. And we've seen with the cabinet reshuffle now the introduction of more politicians, and with the recent appointments last week, even more politicians. And I think we need to be very careful that we don't see an extension of what we saw in Kericho, where you have a sitting cabinet secretary who is actually campaigning for a political party while holding public office. And I think the separation of public resources, public leadership has to be managed extremely carefully. Otherwise, I think the different parties will cry fall.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much for that. Taking a look at the Jubilee administration's achievements and challenges and where more they need to go. That is before the August 2017 election, when their term will come to an end. That was Irungu Houghton, who's the Associate Director for the Society for International Development. Thanks very much for your time this evening.